Okay, welcome everyone. Looks like our guests are starting to file into the room. Thank you so much for joining us wherever you are, joining us from around the world. My name is Scott from SciTrain, and on behalf of all of our colleagues at Bentham Science, we welcome you to this special event, Research and Publishing Ethics, What You Need to Know. And as always, our presenter tonight, our resident expert, is my friend and colleague. He is an incredibly well-published author, as well as an educator, a university professor, and himself a journal editor. This is Dr. Gareth Dyke.
Nice to be here. Thanks very much, Scott. Great to be back. We're working together on SciTrain, doing webinars for Bentham and other publishers. This is absolutely fantastic. Great to see so many attendees joining us today from all over the world. It's really, really good.
Absolutely. And again, thanks to everyone for taking time out of your busy day to join us. We hope that tonight's session with Dr. Dyke will be useful and informative for you. And it is a crucially important topic, isn't it, Gareth? Ethics.
Absolutely.
We're going to talk through some of the key points and principles that we need to understand. Is there anything that you would like our attendees to keep in mind as they listen to your talk today, Gareth?
Well, ethics has become like one of the most hot topics in academic research and academic publishing, especially over the last year or so. So, I mean, as we go through this, we'd really like it if you could give us comments, ask questions, get in touch with us, put your feedback into the chat so that we can have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar that will be useful for you. So if you've got a question about some of the specifics that we're going to talk about today, maybe you're about to submit a paper, or maybe you're doing some research and you're not quite sure what would be the best way to do things to avoid any ethics pitfalls, then let us know. I mean, you don't have to use your real name. You can put information into the chat. Scott will be the only person seeing those messages. So, we can ask them, we can anonymize them, we can come back with comments and questions at the end of this event. Brilliant stuff. Brilliant stuff. Do let us know where you're from, by the way. Do put some comments hi, I'm Gareth, I'm from Budapest, in the chat, so we can see where you're from and we can welcome all of our attendees to this event today. So thanks again for joining.
Absolutely. And as Gareth said, let us know your pain points. If you're struggling with a question, an ethical question, or just have some curiosity questions about ethical ways to approach research and publishing, let us know. We love to hear your pain points. It helps us to help other researchers who might be in your same position, having the same questions, or even other attendees here tonight who have the same question as you. Please don't feel shy. Please ask us anything. The chat is confidential. Only we will see your questions, so feel free to post those. We will share, as Gareth said, Q&A session at the end. We'll share your questions, but we'll keep them anonymous. Don't be shy. Ask us anything. Professor Dyke is here to help with your questions. So,
we're seeing
shall we get?
Yeah, we're seeing people from Egypt, Pakistan, Poland, India. I know you're in Japan, Scott, so we're pretty international today. It's great.
Yes, fantastic. All around the world. Thanks to everyone for joining us.
All right.
And we should say a word about we'd say a word about our friends at Bentham Science. On to you, Professor.
Yeah, let's get started by talking about Bentham Science for a little bit. Fantastic publisher with about 160 online and print journals. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking, Bentham Science, I've not really heard much about that company, well, do have a look at benthamscience.com, eurekaselect.com, and learn more, because this is a fantastic publisher, great opportunity for you if you're looking for a place to submit your next article. 126 hybrid journals, so publishing in traditional form as well as open access, and more than 1,300. Yes, that's right, more than 1,300 online and print books. So lots of content there, lots of information there, and Bentham sells information solutions, provides information solutions across a range of academic, scientific disciplines to libraries and universities around the world. So do have a look at Bentham Science. If indeed you are a librarian, nothing to be ashamed of, librarians, please do scan the QR code that you can see on the screen here, because this QR code or take a screenshot of this slide, of course, you'll be able to use this QR code that we're sharing at the beginning of our event today to get access to all of the Bentham content for 3 months on a trial basis. So that gives you access to the complete collection, including more than 70, this slide's a little bit out of date, more than 70 journals with impact factors. You can empower your researchers with a wealth of knowledge, discover cutting-edge research in science, technology, and medicine. Stay up to date, join the mailing list, get updates sent directly to your email every month. And this is great opportunity. We find that people are often very keen to get access to this content. So do have a look at benthamscience.com, which means now we'll go back into our presentation. We'll start talking a little bit about ethics. This is my background. We won't dwell on that. As Scott mentioned at the beginning, I'm a journal editor as well as an academic researcher and academic author. So I've seen lots of ethical problems, both from my own research. Everybody makes mistakes. We'll talk about those a little bit later. And from the perspective of journal editing and managing the workflow of academic papers coming in to a journal. So let's get started. We're going to begin our event today, and thanks again for joining. Don't be shy. Do put your name and where you're from into that fantastic chat box. We're going to get started by talking about the importance of research ethics, why it's important to have a good understanding of research ethics as part of your training and development. Perhaps you're a young researcher just getting started on your career, getting started on your research journey. Perhaps you're a more senior academic and you need perhaps a bit of a brush up, a bit of a revision of some of those skills, some of that information about the importance of research ethics in your research life cycle. And if you listen to our events regularly, you'll perhaps remember that we often show a slide that looks like a hamster wheel as the side train hamster goes around the research life cycle from idea generation all the way through to data collection and data analysis, writing up the paper, making the submission to a journal, and then dealing with peer review and into the post-publication process. So ethics is super important, and anybody following, even with one eye closed, recent developments in academic publishing will realize, of course, that ethics have really come to the fore over the last couple of years. Ethics in research and publishing are important to maintain public trust, ensure that proper funding use is being maintained, protect your research subjects' health, very important, of course, their rights, medical and healthcare publishing as well. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail. You've got to be able to stand behind the research that you do, ensure its accuracy and its reliability, making sure that you give people in your team or people that have worked with your team the appropriate credit for all of their hard work. Of course, as well, ethics is important for us to promote scientific integrity. We want people out there in the wider world to trust the research that we do, to trust the science that we do, and of course, as well, being ethical about everything that you do, being straightforward, being open about everything that you do as a researcher will help to aid your collaborations and, of course, speed up scientific process. So there's a number of good reasons why having a good understanding of ethics in research and publishing is important, and we've given you a few of them here on the slide. And there's that hamster wheel that I talked about a moment ago. At all of these different stages, idea, funding, data collection, journal selection, article writing, submission and peer review, and publishing and promotion, it's very important to have a good understanding of what's going on in terms of the ethics of what you're doing as a researcher. So that's what this webinar is all about. Ethics matter at every single stage of the research cycle. Funding ethics, research data and research data collection, the ethics of journal selection. Is the journal that you're thinking of sending your article to a predator or potential predatory journal. Then, of course, there's lots to talk about in writing, citing, and managing your sources, not plagiarizing information from other sources into your academic articles. Then submission, ethics of peer review. And then at the end of this event today, we're also going to talk a little bit about the ethics of copyright, publishing copyright, which is not a topic that gets touched on very much at all, especially in researcher training like this. Copyright and what that means for you as a researcher publishing your research in academic journals. Who owns what, and what is your responsibility in that context? So ethics, research and publication ethics. And maybe you've heard of this checklist, the FINER checklist for research. So when you start to build a research project, by the way, Scott and I have lots of other training. You can have a look at our sidetrain.com website. You can go over there and see like what other topics we have in our repertoire of training webinars. But when you start to develop a research project and you start to think about building a piece of research, is that going to be feasible? Is it going to be interesting, both to other researchers in your field as well as to journal editors and potential publication outlets? Is the research going to be novel? Has somebody else done it before? Very important to check. Lots of AI tools are available to help you with all of these different stages. But a key component relevant to us today in our FINER research checklist is ethics. Is the work that you propose to do, is the research that you plan to do going to be ethical as well as, of course, relevant? So as you build a project, as you start to think about your research, feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, and relevant, the FINER checklist for building a research project. And of course, we've got a number of guidelines that we always, keep in mind, when we're putting together a project. We follow the relevant guidelines. COPE, Equator, ICMJE, the International Committee, Medical Journal Editors, and of course you can ask your department's ethics committee as well to help. Protect your subjects. Informed consent, protecting personal and private data, GDPR, and all of that good stuff about what you can and can't share with other people that's been given to you in confidence. Don't cheat. Sounds obvious, and I'm sure that nobody listening to this would ever do this on purpose. That would be pretty bad, but lots of the mistakes that researchers make around ethics are by accident. So hiding, hacking, falsifying data, figures, and using AI tools ethically. We'll talk about that as well in a moment. But most publishers, if not all, are now asking for you to disclose any use of AI tools in the writing process, the figure creation process, even in the data collection process. So keep track of what you use and talk about it when you report your article to a journal. No stealing, that's copyright. We'll come back to that and talk about that at the end of our event today. No reproduction without permission. Stating the true authorship of the work that you're doing. Don't credit co-authors ethically. You've got to do that. Like no ghost or gift authors. Submitting ethically and avoiding conflicts of interest. Right, Scott, how are we doing? Ethics, principles to keep in mind as researchers.
Absolutely. And I love this slide because throughout the course of tonight's event, Professor Dyke will share a lot of very useful information with you, but principles are something we can always fall back on. We might forget information, but if we have principles in place and we apply those to different situations, well, then it's much more powerful than just learning tidbits of knowledge and tips and tricks. So I would suggest everyone to take a snapshot of this slide or revisit the recording later and listen again or read again to what Professor Dyke is talking about here, because these principles will carry you through 80–90% or more of the situations you'll uncover as a researcher, whether it's your research or publishing. So I just wanted to highlight this slide and put a little star on there.
And if you need any links for any of the information that we share in this presentation, for example, COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, the Equator Network, or the ICMJE, that just let us know. We'll be happy to give you links, of course, to any of this information, these checklists. So this is all about what you should be having in mind, things to think about before you start your research at all, because ethics begins when you start to plan your research, not later in the process. As you start to plan, think about those guidelines, useful guidelines to follow. What is your university and your target journal's ethics policy, for example? You're going to submit some work to a journal. They may have very specific requirements that you have to have gone through and done in order to potentially get the work published, especially the case in medical and health sciences journals and research work. So here's the Equator Network. Here's the COPE guidelines, publicationethics.org. We've got the Singapore Statement on Research, Integrity and Ethics there as well. And we'll give you links to things like the ICMJE and GPP3 guidelines relevant to issues like authorship in particular. What do you need to have done to be an author on a research paper? And how can you add, subtract, include other colleagues on your article write-up? Things to do. The Equator Network is absolutely fantastic. It's a network of checklists, a group, a family, a get-together of checklists that can be used for different studies, particularly relevant, of course, to medical and health sciences research. But do have a look at these no matter what your subject area is. If you're doing observational work, for example, you'll find the consort checklist to be very useful. Case reports, qualitative studies, lots of people do qualitative studies across all different academic disciplines, humanities and the STM disciplines. So do have a look at the equatornetwork.org. We recommend it very strongly as a starting point for all of your research journey and building out your ethical basis for the work that you plan to do. So that was part one. We've talked about things to think about before you start your research project, planning your project, and the ethics that lie behind that. Let's have a quick look now in part two at the ethics of research data. Very important. You've got to respect people's rights when you collect data about them or from them. So if you've got a study involving people, get permission from your ethics committee at your university before you start. You'll need that before you can make a submission to a journal. Very important. Lots of papers get submitted and then get turned away because they don't have the relevant ethical permissions in place. Before starting studies with assigned groups, register the plan of your study before you begin. Get permission from participants. Make sure people have agreed to join the study and to have their information published. That's also critically important. You've got to safeguard personal information. The regulations on this vary depending upon what part of the world you're in, but publishing in international journals, the requirements are strict. So check your journal guidelines before you begin the data collection process. Data privacy has to be maintained. People's information has to stay confidential, and you've got to secure all the data that you collect. What happens if in a few years' time, somebody needs to go back to that data and verify it? You've got to do that as well. So very important at the beginning of the data collection process. And we're going to have a quick quiz now, just to make sure that everybody listening to this remains awake. I know it's probably quite hot where you are. Here where I am, it's very, very hot. So I'm falling asleep as I do this. Scott.
Great. Let's go to our first quiz question, our first poll question. The question is it ethical to try analyzing your data in many different ways until you finally get the results that you want? Let's launch this quiz question here. So all can try it. Just a moment here. Okay. All right, let's see what our guests think about this question. Again, the question is it ethical to try analyzing your data in many different ways until you finally get the results that you want? Do you think, yes, this is okay, or no, it's not ethically okay? Answers are coming in hot.
Streaming in, flooding in from all corners of the webinar. I can see that, yes. Wonderful.
Okay, I think most of our answers are in. Our guests have responded. Let's take a look at the results of our poll. So we had 34% of our guests said, okay, this is all right. and 66% of our guests said it's not okay. Well, this is kind of an interesting question. Professor, what's the correct answer to this question ethically?
Well, of course, it's not okay to keep like manipulating and analyzing your data until you get the results that you expected. That's one of the ways that people hack data. We're going to talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. Data dredging, as it's called, one common type of data hack. Of course, it's unethical because you're supposed to be testing a hypothesis, not coming up with something that you think is correct a priori and then just collecting and manipulating your data until you get the answer that you expected, till you get the answer that you want. So you've got to perform your analyses, collect your data in a fair and ethical way. And so, of course, this is not okay. So well done to the 66% of people who got that right. And what's going on with the 34% that said, yes, it's okay? Hopefully we'll be able to lay that one to rest over the course of this event, right, Scott?
Right. Well, what we find with most of the researchers that we work with is that we know that people are basically good and people are not trying in most cases to do something unethical. It's often just a case of not understanding perhaps what the rules or expectations are in some of these choices. So we know our guests tonight are good people and good-hearted people. Hopefully, we'll help you to avoid some of these pitfalls and making choices that seem like they might be okay, but in fact are not ethically okay at all.
Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, as we talked about a moment ago, many of the issues that researchers face in the writing and publishing process to do with ethics are made by mistake. People just simply are unaware that this is something that they're not supposed to be doing. And a good example of that, as we'll come to in a moment, is plagiarism, or how you cite and use sources from other published work. So, just to continue with our discussion of data, don't hack your data analyses. Data dredging is the example that we've just talked about now. Fishing expeditions, well, that's where you just go and try to find data that's going to fit with a predetermined idea that you have, a predetermined hypothesis. And then p-hacking, harking, and cherry picking have to do with manipulating your p-values, looking for data, again, that fit with your hypothesis. And there's a food theme in all of this, but definitely collect your data in a fair and unbiased way, analyze your data in a fair and unbiased way, and report the outcomes. Even if those outcomes are negative, it's very important, and I'm sure this will come up in our Q&A session a little bit later, to report those negative results as well as positive results. And if you're worried about where you can publish negative results and still get credit for that as a researcher, we'll be talking about that, I'm sure, in our Q&A session at the end. So, in terms of reasons to share your data, as well as reasons to be cheerful, transparency and reproducibility, collaboration and cross-disciplinary research, it helps to be open. People will come to you and want to work with you, collaborate with you. Data reuse, of course, if I share my data, that potentially helps other researchers not to repeat analyses that I've already done, I've already conducted. It saves time, it saves money, and you are going to be more trustworthy, more accountable. And this is very, very, very important. And journals expect this. Funding agencies expect this. And indeed, in very many cases, if you get research funding from a government or a research council, they will expect, indeed, they very well will mandate that you need to share your data in an open and transparent way. So these are important reasons to share your data, important reasons to think about the ethics of data collection. Now, in part 3, we're going to move on to the ethics of writing and citing. And as we talked about a little bit earlier as well, plagiarism is going to come up in this section because that's probably the #1 mistake by, not made on purpose, an accidental error that researchers often make when putting their articles together. And there's our little hamster. You can see we've come all the way around that hamster wheel. Now we're talking about article writing and citing in part 3 of this event today. And in order to get this one off to a good start, we're going to just give you another quick quiz. Right, Scott?
Absolutely. Let's try question number 2. The question is it possible to plagiarize yourself? Oh, I think we missed this one, but yeah. So let's just try to answer this one on screen, shall we? Is it possible to plagiarize yourself? You can feel free to stick your answer into the chat window. Let us know what you think. Option A, no, it's not possible to plagiarize yourself. If you wrote it, you own it. Or B, yes, it is possible. Just because you wrote it does not necessarily mean that you own it. Sorry, our chat function isn't working on this question. Feel free to drop your answers into the chat. Let's see what our guests think about this question.
Very important, yes. And this is a mistake that I've made in the past in my own academic writing and publishing. You assume, right, often that if you created something, then that's yours to reuse again. And that's a very fair assumption. And so hence the point of our quick poll question in this section of the webinar.
And this is such a tricky one, and it's so easy to fall afoul of this principle here. Let's see what our guests think. Most of the answers are coming in on B. It is possible to plagiarize yours. I think about 2/3 of our guests are answering B. Professor, tell us about self-plagiarism. Is
I
it
will,
possible?
of course. Yeah, absolutely. Several colleagues in the chat are noting that the poll questions are different to the question on the screen. That's because we'll be coming back to the poll that you saw on your screen a little bit later on. But like, yeah, I mean, this is a really, really tricky one, of course. Like, and I assumed in the case of my own research that, you know, I made that map, I made that figure, I used it in an earlier paper. I don't have to do anything. I can just reuse the same map, the same figure in a later paper. But unfortunately, answer B is the correct one in this particular case. Just because you wrote something, or just because you made something, or photographed something, or described something, a map, a figure, a photograph, you don't necessarily own that. And you always, in academic publishing, need to cite your sources, even if the source is one of your own earlier papers. So self-citation, very important in this context. Self-plagiarism can be a big issue, and researchers fall foul of this one all the time, don't they?
Indeed, they do. And first, an apology to our guests. My itchy trigger finger, I launched the wrong poll there, so sorry to confuse our guests. We'll come back to that other question a little bit later. But I wanted to mention that for someone such as yourself, Dr. Dyke, you are a very voluminously well-published researcher. When you have a certain body of work, it becomes easier and easier to self-plagiarize, doesn't it? If you're someone like me who just has a few publications to their name, then it's maybe not as easy to plagiarize yourself. But in your case, you have so many publications, it must get a bit tricky to avoid, you know, referencing yourself and not citing it carefully. Wouldn't you say?
I mean, you've got to keep track of your sources all the time. And there's a number of really great AI tools that you can use to help with that. Cite, SCITE, is one that we'll highlight in this event. But yeah, like just keeping track of what you've read and what those articles that you've read have said is critically important. And this happens both with text. You may forget that you've put the same text into one of your earlier articles. It can happen with languages too. So watch out. You might write something in your native language, your first language, and then translate that into English and use that in a later paper. It's always much better to cite the original source. And that happened to me once in my earlier career with an article that was written first in Russian and then translated into English and published again in an English journal. We'll come back to that example a little bit later, I'm sure, as well. So very important to make sure that you do not plagiarize your own work. Just because you wrote it doesn't necessarily mean that you now own it. So keep that in mind as we move on through our information today. Always cite your work. More citations always better than less. You can always delete them later in the proofing process of your paper. Review papers are especially useful. You've got to show as a researcher that you're on top of your field. So you'll need to cite articles from across the whole range of time span of your discipline. So older papers as well as more recent literature is important to show a grasp of your field. But having said that, we don't want to see too many of your own papers being cited. That always looks a bit fishy, a bit dodgy if an author has cited just loads of their own previous work. And as we already mentioned, it's a good trick, very important now in this era of AI tools and AI development. You've got lots of help with this. There's no need for you to do it all on your own in your notebook. There are lots of great citation management tools for finding relevant literature that we can share with you, that you can find, and that will help you with this process. So always cite better. It's to have more citations than less. Paraphrasing and citing safely. Read and make notes on your sources, again, using reference management software. Translate using AI tools that make a same length alternative version. You can paraphrase then by retranslating back into English. That's one trick that we use often when helping researchers with the paraphrasing process. So you don't have to quote directly from an earlier piece of work. You can paraphrase that work, but you must cite the original source, even if you're paraphrasing, because the meaning remains the same. That's very important. So if you're sitting there wondering some good ways to learn to be an effective paraphraser, translate and then retranslate back into English. Or what about switching the case, switching the tense, perhaps from passive voice to active voice? That's another trick that we use often when teaching researchers how to paraphrase content. And of course, it's better to cite than using quotations, because articles that contain lots of direct quotations or phrases from earlier work are actually quite hard to read. They're actually quite hard to follow. So paraphrase and cite rather than bringing in direct quotations from earlier work. That would also be a technique that we would recommend. But you've got to ethically summarize and synthesize your sources. So making key notes on key messages and then emphasizing those messages when citing the papers. I'd also say it's a good idea to group articles together. That way you can cite sets of earlier literature to support your arguments, but cite fairly and in a balanced way so that the work of previous researchers is clearly, honestly, and even-handedly presented. I've worked with people in the past who don't agree with a particular point of view or don't agree with a particular hypothesis, so they just don't talk about it. They just don't cite anything to do with that. And that's not fair. That's not ethical. That's not even-handed in the way that you put your papers together. Even if there's something that you disagree with, it's important to talk about it in your own work and put those citations in so that your research paper, your research article is fair and balanced as a piece of academic writing. And having said that as well, I also know lots of people who are very negative, even aggressive in the way that they cite papers that they don't agree with. As Dyke wrote very stupidly in 2024, and they put the papers in, they write negative comments about them, and that also is unnecessary. Even if you disagree with earlier work or think it's no good, be even-handed, be fair when you put your work together, when you cite studies in your own research article. A part of the ethics of citing previous research. Righto, let's move on into section 4, which is going to be about the ethics of submission and peer review. As we move ourselves around that hamster wheel once more, how can you ethically make submissions and how can you ethically manage the peer review process? And here's a graphic that shows the peer review process. It comes in to the submission system at a journal. And this is typical for all publishers. All reputable academic publishers must be using peer review as part of their workflow. At Bentham, for example, the peer review process is double blind for all incoming submissions, which lots of researchers actually really like, because double blind peer review means that you don't know who the reviewers are and they don't know who you are either. So potential bias, country of origin, geography, institution can be immediately removed from the peer review process. And then, of course, we enter into this cycle often with academic articles of revisions and resubmission, working on the paper again after peer review before it finally, hopefully, congratulations, gets accepted. And then the paper moves into the production and publication phase of the cycle. But there are ethical concerns at all of these different stages and phases. And importantly, at the beginning, when picking where to send your paper, watching out for fake journals, predatory journals, blacklisted journals is very important. Some open access journals in particular are just existing to take your hard-earned cash. They're not really interested in actually publishing your paper in any meaningful way. They're not interested in performing peer review in any meaningful way. The open access publishing model, where authors pay an article processing charge, an APC, to see their article out there, open and available to anyone, open access, as the name suggests, has led to lots of dodgy operators who'll try to cheat you out of your money and also your research. Getting increasingly difficult to spot the difference between a real and a fake journal. So this is important at the outset. How can you spot or have a good idea about what might be a fake journal? Look at the website. Indexing. Who's on the editorial board? Are they publishing articles regularly? What's happening there? Are the articles being properly peer reviewed? Do they match the aims and scope of the journal? What's the fee structure? Is the journal charging a fee at submission? If so, avoid it like the plague. You should never, ever, ever be asked for any fee to make an article submission. And of course, another big red flag is the sending of lots of spam emails full of those good old empty promises. So have a look at the journal that you're thinking of making a submission to. Have a look at a number of these flags. You can find reputable journals listed in databases like COPE, the DOAJ, OASPA, INAPS, and AJOL. If you need more information about any of these databases, you find the links here on the screen. Is the journal that you're submitting to going to be using a robust peer review process? Important as well. And are the fees and policies fair? Clearly listed and explained in detail. So real journals are listed and indexed. They use proper, effective, transparent, and easy to understand peer review. For example, at Bentham, as I mentioned, the peer review process is double blind, which is very important. Lots of authors like that. And the fee structures are clearly explained, listed, and explained in detail. Again, do take a screenshot of this, or we'll put a number of these links into the chat so that you can go and have a look at resources like thinkchecksubmit.org, publicationethics.org, and the directory of open access journals. Absolutely fantastic. So, thinking about making a submission, here's a few things to check as well. Making sure that you're in good shape to make that submission. Has your paper or any part of it been published before? You'll need to flag that to the editor in your cover letter. For example, it was published already as a PhD, or parts of it were published already in an MSc, for example. That's important. Has your paper been published before? What are the preprint policies of the journal or of the publisher? Can you make a submission that has previously been on a preprint platform? Usually yes, but not all journals support this model for publishing. And again, we can talk about this in our Q&A in a moment. Are you going to be talking about this work at a conference? This is important as well to think about, to flag. If you've presented your work previously in any way, then think about that when you make your submission. Flag that to the journal editor. Does the journal have an embargo on previously shared research? Are you salami slicing? And this is important as well, because lots of people do this. They slice up a piece of research into what we call those least publishable units. They try to make 10 papers out of a project that really only warrants 3 or 4. Salami slicing is a bad idea, both for your journal success rate as a researcher, but also for your reputation. And we've talked about this already, but keep this in mind as well. Is this a translation of a previous publication. Have you published this before in another language? Don't fall foul of this one as I did in my career. Keep that in mind as well. You can, of course, cite the original source in another language. And let's check these as well before we make submissions. Don't try to publish unless you've got all of the correct copyright permissions. Translations, preprints, summaries, working papers, excerpts, discussion papers, blogs, conference proceedings, and reports. Because in this day and age, take it from me, in this day and age, you will get caught. Journals are using sophisticated checking systems to look at papers that come into their submission systems. You will not get away with it, and that will look terrible in your career in the future. It's usually okay, of course, but do check carefully and declare to your journal, as we've discussed, if the work was previously part of a university thesis, even an assignment or an essay. Was it a conference abstract? Often you can cite those in your later fully peer-reviewed paper. A poster, grant applications, patents, and online trials if you're working in clinical medical research. These are important areas to keep in mind. And just quickly then, to finish off our presentation today before we go to our Q&A, let's have a quick look at the ethics of copyright and ownership. And Scott's going to be back for this quick quiz. If you write an original work, does the copyright automatically belong to you? Very important question to keep in mind. If you write an original work, does the copyright of that paper automatically belong to you? Scott, how are we doing? Are you there? There he is. Fantastic stuff.
Okay, let's try that poll question from before. Hopefully I'll launch the correct poll this time. Let's try it. Okay, here we go. I'm going to relaunch this one. Okay, the question is, if you write an original work, does the copyright automatically belong to you? Yes or no? Now, this kind of relates to our earlier question about self-plagiarism. So again, if you write an original work, does the copyright automatically belong to you? Let's see who thinks yes or no. Answers coming in hot.
They're streaming in, they're flooding in. It's fantastic. And getting towards not quite 50-50, but yeah, this is another tricky one that hopefully we'll be able to give you some insights on in a moment.
Okay, looks like most of our answers are in. I'm going to close off the poll here and see what our guests said today. So sharing the results, 33% of our guests said yes, it does automatically belong to you if you write an original work, and 68% said no. Professor, what's the correct answer?
Let's have a look at this one, because this is another very interesting one. Well, if you write an original work, you do, in fact, own the copyright. That's the case. You do own the copyright. But very often in journal publishing, what's going to happen next is that you're going to sign it away. So the correct answer to this is yes. And about 35% of our attendees got that one, I think, right, Scott? Like about a third of our attendees got that. But what happens in journal publishing when you send a paper to a journal, if it's an open access journal, don't forget that we've got lots of those at Bentham, so do have a look at those as well. If it's an open access journal, you keep the copyright. But if it's not an open access journal, if it's a traditional journal publishing the content behind a subscription paywall or giving you the opportunity to convert the content to open access via what we call a gold open access conversion, you may not own the copyright on your own work. Very important. You'll get a copyright clearance form or some kind of copyright form from your journal, from your publisher. Read it carefully when you put your paper into the journal. Don't make the mistake that I used to make, just signing everything, happy to get the paper published. Off it goes to production in the journal. Check what you're signing away. This is an important consideration to keep in mind when choosing a journal, right, Scott? You want to keep control of your own content.
Absolutely. And we do have a whole other webinar presentation on this topic. So I hope you'll visit us in a future event. It's more than we can cover in just 1 hour today. But absolutely. Back to you, Professor. This is some fantastic advice coming up on the next slide. So I would again suggest our guests to star or bookmark this one because there's some great information here. Back to you,
Yeah.
Professor.
And as Scott mentioned, we have lots more content on this. So if you're listening to this and thinking, ooh, I'd like to learn more, ooh, I'd like to get more information from my university or for my research group, do get in touch with us because we'd love to show up virtually like two apparitions at your university and provide an online webinar. So protecting your own work with copyright, very important. It's yours automatically until you sign it away. And keep that in mind with the journal selection that you make with your work. Look at your journal policies before submitting to a journal. Make sure you do get, either from your journal or from your preprint platform, a document object identifier, because this protects your priority over the work. And if you have questions about what those are, we'll explain more in a moment. Consider open access publishing, because this automatically means in almost all situations that you will keep the copyright of your research, which is very important. I would say preprint to establish primacy. And this is a good option for researchers in almost every discipline. You make sure that you are the first to talk about something. Then you've got that preprint registered. You've got the content with a document object identifier number. So preprints and copyright. Authors retain copyright on preprints. They can distribute their work freely before formal publication. Some journals may have specific policies on accepting manuscripts originally shared as preprints. You're going to be posting a preprint. This doesn't affect your rights to publish the work in a peer-reviewed journal later. And that's a big misconception that lots of researchers have about the use of preprints, actually. And maybe we'll get some questions on that in a moment. Preprints can be cited. Use of the content is subject to the copyright terms set by you, the author, and Creative Commons licenses are the tool that we use as researchers in order to do this. You retain copyright. You've got licensing options over your own research via Creative Commons. You will then potentially make publisher agreements in the future, not something that you necessarily want to do. And copyright protection over your own research allows you to reuse it commercially and non-commercially, share it with colleagues, and make sure that you get the proper attribution. And there's going to be a copyright protection duration, but usually that's the lifetime of the author, depending on the country. So very important to keep this in mind as well. As Scott mentioned, we've got other content on this that we'd love to share with you. If you're listening to this and you'd like to learn more, you can reuse, save, and share the paper freely in the future. Have a look at your journal's license on copyright. The two most common ones that you see in academic publishing are what are called CC BY-NC for non-commercial sharing, and the BY1, which allows you to archive and share the paper freely with the required citation, which of course is what most researchers want to see, that they're able to share their work, other people can use it, and that they retain the copyright. Right, there we go. That brings us to the almost end of our event today, this fantastic Sidetrain Bentham Science webinar. But I do think we have a bit of time left, right, Scott?
I hope we have some time for some questions for you, Professor. We've got some great questions coming in from our guests. Let's take a look at the first question here. This was a guest who would like some more clarification or information about why it doesn't look good if we cite our papers, our own papers, a lot or too much. Can you explain in a bit more detail why this doesn't look good when we cite too many of our own papers? If someone such as yourself is a very well-published researcher and has a lot of papers that are available to cite, so standing on your own shoulders and citing yourself, why is it not a good idea to do that too much?
Well, that's a great question, and thanks for it. I mean, it just looks strange. Like if I write a paper in my own specific research field, there's a number of other colleagues also working in that field and a number of competing viewpoints and hypotheses and things that we're testing as researchers. So for sure, like you could write a paper, stack it with your own citations, but that is not a balanced way to present the literature to a reader. You can put, of course, some of your own citations in the paper, but you also need to include citations from others. And that gives a good impression to the editor, to the peer reviewers, to the readers, and shows that you're a reasonable, balanced researcher. You're not just trying to up your own citation rate by stacking your papers with your own publications. It raises red flags to editors and peer reviewers. And by the way, something that you should never, ever do if you're peer reviewing a paper is request the addition of your own citations in return for giving that paper a favorable outcome in peer review. We see that a lot, and that is not okay. That's not ethical at all.
Fantastic. Thanks, Professor, for your insights, both as an author and as a journal editor. On to the next question. This is a great question. Can you recommend an application or software, preferably free, for plagiarism identification? We suspect one colleague to be too inspired by another's work when writing their paper. Great question. There are loads of them. The quotation marks were included by our guests. So any that we can recommend off the bat, some plagiarism checkers or?
I mean, just a quick Google search for free plagiarism checking will bring up a number of tools that you can use. They'll have limits on the amount of text you can put in and the amount of text you can cut and paste in before they'll start to charge you for the use of those tools. And also because they're free, their coverage of already published literature is going to be less good, because the way these tools work is that they send out like API calls or they search for you like available literature. So not all of the published literature by any means is available for free online, as you very well know yourselves if you're a researcher. So, I mean, we would recommend that if you really want to check and you really want to be sure, then go to a tool like Turnitin. You may have to pay a little bit of money for access to that. We can help you with that if you get in touch with us after the event, but that will give you like a cast iron answer to your question. So going to a tool like that publishers use is going to be the most effective. But sure, there are free versions, free tools online as well. But great question. Thank you. Hopefully you can discover whether your colleague has been inspired by the work of another colleague.
Absolutely. Thanks for your answer, Professor. And yeah, I also second that. Turnitin is the one that I remember using when I was a graduate student. And now they tend to have institutional contracts. So yeah, as far as for individual checking, well, there are more and more tools coming up all the time for this. And as Gareth said, they often have a free tier. So I just do a quick Google search, but Turnitin is a very robust and well-known tool, but typically only available for institutional contracts, but it's a great tool. Excellent question. Thanks for your question, and thank you, Professor, for your answer. Next question. This is a meaty question. Our guest asks, this is a data analysis question. Can we combine values generated from different techniques or methods when doing meta-analysis? Well, this is a great question. My former organization did a lot of systematic reviews and meta-analyses. It's not my field, so I won't try to answer this one. But the question continues, for example, intensity values from Western blot and concentration values from ELISA. Now, technically, these can be combined, but statistically it can be combined. But is it ethical to combine data from different techniques or methods? I guess that's the general question. Data from that has gathered different techniques or methods. Is it ethical, even if it's statistically possible to combine them? Is it ethical to combine them? It's a great question.
It is a great question. And what I think we're going to do with that question is ask you to drop us a line like after the event, and we're going to connect you with somebody who really understands the answer to that question, like a professional statistician, of which we have several that we know. We have many friends who are doing this kind of thing for a living, but I would agree with Scott. Like, I don't feel personally, professionally confident to answer that question myself. So what we'll do is we'll contact you, or please drop us a line like My WhatsApp is on the SciTrain website. You can get in touch with us through the SciTrain site. You can find us both easily on LinkedIn. Just copy and paste this question again to us, and we'll connect you with somebody who can actually really help. But that is a great question. Thank you so much for it. And I hope that that's not too much of a cop-out for us to say that. But we don't want to give you the wrong information around a question like that. Thank you.
It's a great question, and yeah, it's definitely outside our fields of specialization. So reach out to us, and we're happy to, or actually, we'll reach out to you and see if we can get you an answer to your question. Great question, thank you. Looks like we have time for maybe one more question. Do we, Professor? This is a question from a guest who asks, this is a great question too. What do you think about citing obviously poor or not properly conducted work? Even if I state that something is wrong with the cited paper, they still get the citation, and that can work to their advantage. Oh, this is a great question. Your thoughts, Professor?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We've never had that question before either. So, of course, if you cite a paper that Scott's written, he gets another tick on his citation record. But that doesn't take into account whether his paper is any good or not, right? And this is a good question. So, I mean, in terms of balanced citations, if Scott's work, even if it's bad work, is important for the study that you're putting together, then I would say you have to cite it. Because as you set up your arguments in your article, it's actually quite important to have, targets to go for. That's not the right expression, but you need like a point and a counterpoint, a balance to your hypothesis. So you need for some people to disagree with you, and you need for some literature to be out there that you can show, my work is correct. It disproves the hypothesis that Scott put forward in his earlier paper. So I would say yes, like it's a good idea to cite that. I would think about your own citation rate, your own career, your own publication success, rather than worrying too much about giving somebody else like a free citation, if that makes sense. I mean, that would be my response to that. What do you think, Scott?
Yeah, I think my answer would be about the same. I think it's sometimes important to write critically, particularly if you're writing your discussion section or you're putting your work in context of others or trying to contrast and compare your work with that just come before you. I think it's important sometimes to write critically about past papers. In that case, you obviously have to cite them. So I think I'd agree with you, Professor. I think you're more experienced in that area than I am, but I think sometimes you do have to cite or quote questionable papers to put your paper in context.
I get that. Kind of hurts. Like you might not agree with somebody. You might think that they're a terrible researcher, and by citing them, you're still increasing their productivity. We got one comment or several comments about upcoming events. Like if you look at our website or at the Bentham Science website, you'll find more information about our upcoming webinars. If you follow us on LinkedIn, follow SciTrain, Bentham Science on LinkedIn, you'll learn about our upcoming events as we post about them on social media. Just quickly, some other colleagues are asking about ChatGPT content. Is it wrong practice to use it in articles? No, it's fine, just so long as you flag that when you make your submission to the journal editor. Absolutely fine to use these tools, no problem at all, but you've got to be open and transparent when you make your submission. Components of this paper were translated or generated using prompts into ChatGPT. Okay, great question. You're muted, Scott.
Oh, I apologize. One last quick question. What is article retraction? Very timely question, given some of the big retractions that we've seen recently. In brief, Professor, what is a retraction and why does it happen?
So a retraction is when a journal or a publisher or even an author has decided that they no longer wish to stand behind the research that is published or has been published in a particular paper. So journals and publishers retract papers because they've learned something about the study or something about the authors that causes them an ethical issue. Data was made up, or data was stolen, or an author was added who shouldn't have been there. So that's one way that a paper can get retracted. The other way is for an author, and this happens far less often, but it does nevertheless happen. I publish a paper, and then later I learn that there's a problem with the data or with the study, and I no longer wish to have that paper on my permanent record, so I retract it. So a retraction is where a paper is removed from the record. I mean, it still exists in the record, of course, but you'll see a retraction notice on the top of the paper in its online form for those specific reasons. It hasn't happened to you. I hope it doesn't happen to you, because having a paper retracted can be a bit of a black mark. So be ethical in your writing and publishing.
And it's worth saying, and in fact, by coincidence, I just worked with a group of authors a couple of days ago to help them with a retraction letter, and they voluntarily retracted their own paper, which I thought was commendable. They did the ethical thing. They found some inconsistencies in their data that they hadn't realized at the time of submission, and they did the right thing, the ethical thing. They self-retracted, and they are going to republish the paper. And it should be fine once they're republished, but it's great that they made the ethical choice and decided to self-retract, and I think that's commendable. So
fantastic. Thank you, everybody, for all the great questions. We'll get back to you if you've asked us a direct question in the chat a little bit later on. And yeah, great stuff.
Thank you, Professor, for your time as always. As I always say, I learned so much from joining these events with you. And thanks to our guests from joining us all around the world. And thanks to our friends at Bentham Science. Please visit them and find out all about the high quality, robustly peer-reviewed journals at Bentham. And thanks again, everyone. Have a wonderful Thursday, and we'll see you at our next Bentham event.